Welcome back to Muslims and Mental Health. We are continuing on with Dr. Joseph Futerman. We're talking about the psychology of hate. We are going to continue with addressing the question of how hate can be assessed.
Well, that's, when I, again, was preparing for this, are there any assessments of hate? And the truth is, no, there aren't. So we don't have anything built yet. I think perhaps there's some brilliant graduate student out there even now, maybe, who's coming up with a way. Part of that is the problem, again, that we haven't really agreed on how we define it. You can't assess something until you agree on the definition. Now, again, I have been talking about Sternberg's definition, his in the field of what we call operationalization, how you make it operate. In that case, we would have to measure the experience of disgust, revulsion, disdain, the experience of anger or fear towards a given object. Mm-hmm. Whether that object is human, a group, or an object of some sort. So that if you measured those, mm-hmm. You could argue that that existed, and then you would have to measure commitment in some way if we use his model. Right now, I really don't know that we have an assessment. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful question, and one we could use work on. So anybody out there who wants a great dissertation project, get on it.
It's interesting, though, that we haven't looked more into this, right? Because even taking Sternberg himself, people have discussed his tripartite of love mm-hmm. extensively. And yes. In fact, you'll see a lot of, if you did a search on his tripartite of love, there's lots of right. things written, there's videos, there's all kinds of things out there. Yet the fact that he did this other on hate is largely ignored, and as he acknowledges in the psychology of hate, and as you did earlier, it's really understudied. And so it begs the question to me of, why are we so afraid of the darkness? Why are we not exploring the validity of what are, quote, dark emotions or hate, as much as we would explore love? It would seem that, certainly given our climate, this is important right now.
Mm-hmm. I would agree.
And that we have not really fully explored that is interesting. I don't know what that says exactly, but it certainly has that sort of balloon question hanging out there.
Well, I think you touched on it to start with. And maybe we could go back to our earlier notion that hate has survival value. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, love does too, but hate takes us to that place where what we are worried about is our survival.
So you think it's an existential?
I think it raises the existential, mm-hmm. the existential challenge that I will be dead. Mm. And we don't like to look at our own mortality. We don't like to look at those notions of things that are about to or possibly contribute to our limited survival.
So this becomes a very interesting question then for the Muslim, because we are supposed to be looking at that existential question, particularly our hereafter, our death, mm-hmm. what that will, what are we contributing toward that? Mm-hmm. What will that be like? Are we securing a place in the hereafter for us? And in a positive way,
Got it.
as opposed to a negative way. So it seems like it would be even more relevant for the Muslim community to consider this question.
I think it's relevant at this time for everyone to consider. I think that from what I know of Muslim tradition, it is certainly something that as a religious tradition that it would consider. But yeah, I think certainly that's a necessary requirement, whether it is only for Muslim. I would feel...
Yeah, certainly not exclusively, but I'm just highlighting the fact that it actually is quite... It falls right in line with Muslim values, Muslim beliefs. So I want to move into the next question then, which is how we can combat hatred from a mental health perspective.
Yeah, that's something easy. It's an excellent question. Not one for which, in thinking about this issue, I have an answer, quite honestly. How do we combat any of the choices that people might make, and understand that there is, although I have suggested a certain instinctual quality to this, there is a choice. It's not, and furthermore, I don't want to suggest that because there may be an instinctual component to this, that therefore there must be a certain number of things we hate. That, you know, you have to fill up your hatred container. I don't believe that's so. How do we help people to come into contact with their own mortality, with the acceptance of that mortality, with the acceptance of danger in being mortal? And
so do you see this more like a logotherapy idea, or?
Well, logotherapy, of course, focuses on meaning, and meaning becomes the antidote, if you like, to our mortality. It might work.
Or maybe more like Buber in the sense of actually seeing the other.
I think both could be part of it. I think when we think about answers in therapy, they're first of all always individual. Therapy does not, or should not, offer, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, institutional answers. We shouldn't say, everyone needs to fit this box.
Right.
This is how everyone's psychology is. The mind is profound, which is a meaningless statement in and of itself, or a tautological statement, I suppose.
Because another equally valid, perhaps, approach could be resiliency, right? Creating resiliency, protective factors.
I mean, I tend to think, there are, any approach that is going to work is going to have people reach a point where they are not responding out of revulsion, and they are not responding out of anger or fear. And if we can get to some place where that's the case, then that will help with hate. If I had that system, if we had in therapy any one system that we could point to the studies and say, see, this takes care of this. At that moment, whoever has that, first of all, is one of the saviors of humanity and probably a very rich person. Clearly, I don't have either of those qualities or credits, so I don't have it.
So I'm thinking, actually, I hope we don't ever reach that place, because of the diversity that we have. It's something I actually enjoy.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to have like a one way or one size fits all.
Yeah. I think if we can get people to address the negative emotions associated with it in therapy, then they are going to suspect the narrative. And once they suspect the narrative, that may be all we can do with therapy. Other people have to do the other piece, which is provide a different narrative.
And so let's just deconstruct that a little bit more.
Okay.
Because recognizing that we have limited information out there about hatred and therapy, let's see if we can deconstruct that a little bit more into the mindset of those who hate and those who are hated. What ideas would you like to offer on that?
Well, I think, I mean,
you've talked a little bit about those who hate and the idea of survival, but if there's anything else you want to add in that regard.
I think, quite honestly, what we, again, we have to try and look at from a solid reality-based perspective for those who hate. Are these people, or is this group, is this thing, is this change? The Luddites originally hated technology, and they were a group of weavers. And we use the term now for anybody who doesn't have wearable technology on them. But in those days, they were a group of weavers who saw their jobs being automated. And they're the only people who do weaving by hand anymore exist in third world nations, or they are hobbyists who do it because they love textiles. And so they hated technology. Interestingly enough, because it is based on fear, because it is based upon revulsion, survival, often haters feel themselves the victims.
So it sounds to me like you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that a binary of those who hate and those who are hated is actually not as fruitful per se as just recognizing that they have actually a lot of similar qualities.
Well, and that we must, again, we have to remove these powerful arguments about survival from the story. And that's hard. That's very hard to do. People's survival is being threatened. Again, survival is conservative. It says, do today what you did yesterday. If what I did yesterday was this particular job, and now this particular job is not being, is being moved out of the realm of human activity and into the realm of mechanical activity or robotic activity, I don't look at it that way. It was my job, and clearly it was a human activity. Some other human must be taking this. Therefore, it's somebody who's willing to do it for less money. I don't look and say, oh, spot welding the pieces of this particular device is no longer something we need a human to do. We have plenty of robotic armatures that do that. I look at it and say, no, I'm a great spot welder, and survival says I should keep being a great spot welder, and so that's what I should do. And clearly some other human must have taken it. We have to remove these articles of survival and survivability as part of the nature of the belief from each side. And I'm not saying that the hated, those people or groups who are being hated at a particular time's survival, isn't being challenged. It is. But it's being challenged because the narrative has become about the survival of the hater. Mm-hmm. How do we take that out? The binary there isn't really there except as the hater applies it to survival. They will survive, I won't. And then, and quite honestly, when you get to that place, you begin to understand rage. Mm-hmm. Haters are frequently those people whose anger has reached, as we defined it earlier, that place of rage, where they are willing to destroy themselves in the act of destroying the hated object. So that's when we talk about all of the ways we need to address whatever group that is acting out of hate, any hate group, the big thing is we have to take away this story that their survival is threatened. And often we can't, because sometimes their survival is threatened. Mm-hmm. Generally, it is not by the group they choose to hate. And that is because their survival is threatened by evolution, by our evolving technology, by the changes in the world.
Or by the narratives that they've created for themselves, not necessarily based on lived experience.
Yes, mm-hmm. And by the conservatism of survival itself. Do tomorrow what you did today. Mm-hmm. When we look at it from a grand perspective, if we could remove just that piece, if we could teach that survival is adaptation, if we could create the expectation in all of those who live today that to survive, you must be willing to change. That's our real answer in terms of the broad piece. Will we ever get rid of hate? No. But can we come back to many of the broader hate movements? And no matter who or what they are anti, are because people believe they can't change. It's all I've ever known how to do. It's all I've ever done. Now this or they are taking it away from me. And I've got to get it back, or me and mine won't survive. No, you have to adapt.
So, take this a little further. What do you think are the consequences for particular groups like the Muslims or the Jews or the LGBTQ, for example, who are often victims of the communal hatred that we see in the United States particularly?
What do I think? Your question, what are the results for psychologically for the hated group? Let me understand your question.
Yeah. I mean, what are
consequences for the hated group? I think in many ways, we obviously know the physical consequences. They are horrific and problematic. The psychological consequence is that any time we threaten somebody's survival, and we learn over time that this group or this type of individual will threaten our survival, then the conceptualization of hatred that we are starting with should actually go into play. They should learn to hate those who have hated and attacked them. And that's the problem. And I'm not saying should in a moral sense. I'm saying when you ask what the consequence would be. so that as we threaten people's survival, they learn to hate back, and then those who feel most threatened take action within that group, which then leads to the original group that hated hating again, and we have an unbalanced reinforcing feedback loop where we expect there to be a growth of hatred until there are the unbelievable convulsions of violence we call war. And that's very sad.
Kind of in contrast with the whole idea that went sort of viral of Trump, love Trump's hate, right? Although that was meant really for a political use, but it's contrary to what we're suggesting here in terms of the response of the hate toward the hate.
Right. I think I mean again, what's interesting is, and sadly I suggested this some time ago in our conversation. I don't know whether Trump truly hates. I find it hard to believe he sees his survival as threatened. I tend to think he is far more of the cynical nature of using hate in others to get what he wants. And I'm sorry to be saying that.
No, I mean, it seems to have played that way.
The narratives he connects to are hateful narratives. They are narratives that maintain that fear. The primary story that his campaign told, "Make America Great Again," tells a story of rolling back change. We will go back to a steady state. I don't know whether that was the 70s or the 50s or the 1890s. I have friends who would suggest any of those periods. And we will therefore not require any of his supporters to change and be part of a future. They can remain unchanged in the past, and this will give them survival. I think, and I would not, or I would certainly hesitate to suggest in any way I understand what his motives may be for wanting to be president. But the way the narrative that they have used has been constructed, it is, we'll give you survival by taking you to the past where you know you did survive. It's a very powerful narrative.
Yeah.
And it fits
because even subconsciously people would, that
it fits entirely with this model of hate. You create hatred, and it works brilliantly well. You take a group. So if we can find an identifiable group, and we can focus on them, then in that case we create a way to say they are the thing we must change. They are the problem, and you will be safe again when we change this problem.
So, when you're talking about feedback loops, of course, you got me thinking systematically or systemically, and I would like to detour for a second to ask you, because there have been incidents that have been of hatred that have been committed toward individuals, right? We've seen individual attacks, but we've also seen a rash of institutional attacks. So in the last recent time, a mosque in Santa Barbara was set fire. There have been mosques in Texas set fire. a Jewish cemetery was
Right.
vandalized. So do you see a difference in terms of that manifestation, whether a group or individual systemically chooses to attack individuals versus an institution? Is there something different psychologically at play there as to why one would attack an institution versus an individual, or do you see it all as part of the same?
I tend to see it all as part of the same. I tend to think that, quite honestly, again, going back to Sternberg's model and the emotional components inherent there, I think that you are looking at victims of opportunity. I think it also depends upon the sense of, which goes into our anger and fear component, or the passion component, as he would call it. Passions get more intense as our sense of questioning our own survivability increases. And so the more trouble I particularly experience, the more likely I am to attack. The more likely I am to attack, I will take, dependent upon some type of equivalence to my particular fear or anger, I'll choose the size of my victim. Mm-hmm. The bigger my fear, what I'm suggesting is a direct correlation between the bigger my fear or anger, the larger the victim I will attack, because the more people should feel this. I mean, this also goes to the piece. Terrorism is, at least for me, an act of communication, primarily. A terrorist is trying to communicate their felt reality, what they experience as their reality, to another. Now that means that they have failed individually, and they have placed that, therefore, in a larger venue. It's sometimes hard to see this in that personal way for the terrorist when we look at large political acts, because the politicians jump on them and turn them into a political piece. For me as a psychologist, I look at acts of terrorism like Columbine. Mm-hmm. I look at the two kids there and I ask myself the question, what were they trying to accomplish? Why does one choose to kill a large portion of the population? What are you trying to do? Is it just kill them? Is this just an act of hatred? Does this help your survivability? And the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And we look at terrorists generally. Terrorists generally do not, rarely, survive the acts they commit. All terrorists, whether they are school shooters or whether they are politically motivated acts of terrorism, terrorists rarely survive their acts of terrorism. And that's whether we look at people who are school shooters or people who commit broadly political acts. So they are not in this moment looking for survival. Mm-hmm. The terrorist is trying to communicate, trying to get others to feel what they themselves feel. Mm-hmm. And we have it in the name. Terrorism is the installation of terror.
This is why, although I am not an Islamic law expert, as a Muslim I do know that in Islamic law we define terrorism by inciting fear.
Right.
So when, and I think part of what we see in the Muslim community in terms of a feeling of injustice is that certain acts are called terrorism, whereas things like the movie theater, where the man in Colorado, or the nightclub, or well, I think they did actually decide that that was an act of terrorism, right? But some of these other national
mass shootings and
manifestations are not considered terrorism because they're not done by a certain group. Whereas for the Muslim, anything that incites fear like that in a broad way is meant to be terrorism. It's an act of hiraba, I believe. So that's created a little bit of angst for the community. Why some people are called terrorists while others are not. But it's very much in line with what you're describing. I want to move on because we're running out of time. But it's
goes back to survival.
Yeah. So just a couple quick things. I mean, they're not maybe that quick, but how do you see hate and hatred both affecting the self-image of a person, mm-hmm. and also maybe what it has to do with that self-image? You sort of talked about this a little bit earlier, and at the same time I want to talk about what the negative effects are of hatred.
I think that, well, again, hatred itself suggests that there is a large threat to my survival out there. That raises the question, okay, how am I going to survive? Literally, we know that creates an issue of self-esteem. If I am constantly feeling that I cannot survive, or that my survival is challenged, then I am not capable of acting, if we, by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for instance, mm-hmm. in a self-actualized or even a loving and caring way. Survival needs are at the bottom of the triangle, they're the base. So hatred indicates that I have a constant commitment narrative to my survival being threatened. My survival being threatened indicates I have a question about my value, to the extent that I am perhaps not one of the survivable ones. That leads to my having an inherently low self-esteem. I am not capable of doing the things that show that I esteem myself until I have found a way to remove myself from, or remove the hated object from around myself. So either I get away from them or I get rid of them. And so literally my argument would be that inherently living in hatred is going to limit the possibilities of self-esteem. It's going to limit the possibilities of taking the actions which would validate my being more than just this person who's fighting for survival. Living in hatred takes me back to constantly functioning at the level of a threatened animal.
Mm-hmm. Which I think we could probably do a whole episode on self-image and this question, because so many things are coming up for me around one's moral development, or feeling that they are not redeemable anymore, and
again, if we go, for instance, to Kernberg's moral development, mm-hmm. what you look at when you think about that is, can they move to the higher stages of moral development in this place where they are consistently feeling a survival need? Mm-hmm. And so long as you're in survival need, you can't. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to see moral development. We're not going to see them moving on. We could also argue that survival needs, again, and we're combining pieces that people normally don't combine, but if we take Maslowian notions again of the necessity of having met your survival needs, and we look at what's going to happen in Piagetian cognitive development, so that we are talking now about whether they can move beyond seeing the world in a split form, in a black and white form, is not going to be a possibility.
Yeah. So I think that's a great place to put this conversation on hold. We are going to do another episode later this month on what is trauma, and this relates so well with that, given that if we think about trauma and societies that have been traumatized severely, and how they will not be equipped to continue that moral development because they're in survival mode. I mean, this is a whole nother topic in and of itself that we will get into. It's an important topic, and I'm glad you opened the box for that topic, but we're not going to be able to finish that today.
No.
So
we've already ranged pretty widely, I'm sorry to say.
No, yes, but I appreciate so much what you bring to this conversation, because I think that you've given a lot of food for thought for people to consider and to even reconceptualize the whole idea of hate, both in terms of its usefulness and how it's been sort of broadly misunderstood. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for joining us. I want to move now to our fun part, which is our few fun questions that we like to ask at the end. I've changed them because as our viewers know, that Dr. Futerman has been a guest before for us, and don't want to ask you the same questions.
You always bring me in on the fun topics. I think the last time was depression.
Yes, the last time was depression, but I think you are somebody I would choose to go into darkness
hateful
with.
And depressed with. Thank you.
Go into the darkness with, to understand darkness, to I don't think you're intimidated by it, so
high praise. Thank you.
You're welcome. So first I'd like to ask you, the first fun question is, what is your favorite type of cultural production and why?
Okay. Well, help me with what you mean by a
cultural production. Being, the arts, anything that's in the realm of the arts. It could be theater, it could be movies, it could be poetry.
A couple of different, I guess, a couple of different answers. My favorite cultural production to participate in is poetry. I find writing poetry to relax me and open me to ideas. I find writing to do that too. In terms of actually seeing, I'm really a movie fan, and I'm a movie fan at the level, and again I come at this from a Jungian perspective. I think the movies are collective dreams, and because of that I tend to interpret them in that way. So not many people actually like to go to movies with me, because the after movie conversation is, what does this say about the nature of humanity and its development? And they're going, it's a musical, Joe, leave it alone. It was fun. Didn't you just have fun? And I'm going, but why that number? And so, yeah, that would be my favorite to observe and participate in that level. But hard for me to find people who actually want to join me when I do that. And then the other is poetry.
So given that, what is your favorite piece of music or art or poetry for that matter, I guess, or a movie, since those are two of your favorites?
Wow. Favorites.
You had to pick one.
Oh, yeah. It's always about picking one. I think perhaps my favorite movie of all time is Groundhog Day. And I think it is Groundhog Day because Groundhog Day is...
That's a very conservative film, by the way.
It is. It is. It's a story about finding your shadow. The groundhog goes out to see his shadow, and of course Bill Murray's character goes out to find his shadow.
And it's so fitting with our topic because the day repeats and repeats.
It goes back and it goes on and it goes on. And I think that theme is so important. We live in the same place unless we are willing to learn from this day. Unless we learn something new today, tomorrow will be the same day. And certainly he must find his shadow and find his reason to exist in the one day he lives forever. How many of us do that?
We don't. We talk about how every day should be our last. We should treat every day like our last. But who actually lives that way?
Yeah. So actually that is probably my favorite movie of all time.
Well, thank you. And then the last question is, what is your favorite word and why?
Favorite word? Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, because it's got a great dance number.
Okay, so we'll leave it there. Is there anything that you feel that we left out, we missed, that you wanted to say?
Oh no, we've covered the whole thing encyclopedically. We obviously have covered there's so much. And the important chance to talk about these things and to think about them. Our discussions have raised so many questions for me and things that I will be chewing on. So thank you very much. Yeah, and just so much out there to think about this issue of hatred. But, I mean, we ranged into other things because we couldn't not. It is all one whole thing. And so once you unravel one thread, you have to face the whole weave. And so much. And we must do what we can do today. Thank you.
Thank you. So this brings us to the conclusion of another episode of Muslims and Mental Health. Thank you for joining us. If you would like to continue to join us, you can join us on our adjunctive website at www.nafshealertherapy.wordpress.com. And again, if you would like to contact Dr. Futerman, maybe you want to see him yourself, we will have his information here following at the end of this episode. Thank you.